We're here, obviously, to discuss Rowan Arar and David Fitzgerald's new book, The Refugee System, a Sociological Approach, which was published by Polity in 2023, but also by Wiley in 2022.
Polity.
Okay, we're going with 2023 Polity. Dr. Rowan Arar is an assistant professor in Law Societies and Justice, and she's also adjunct in sociology and CSDE, where she's an affiliate with CSDE. And her work focuses on global migration, state responses to it, and the impact of the latter on experiences and trajectories of people who are compelled to migrate. Her research is abundant and substantial and impactful, and she's been publishing in some of the most prestigious venues in her subfield. We are delighted to have her here at UW. We're also delighted to have Dr. David Fitzgerald, who's a professor of sociology, Gildred Chair in U.S.-Mexican Relations, and co-director of the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UC San Diego. David is the author of many award-winning books and many articles. Most perhaps relevant to this topic today is Refuge Beyond Reach, How Rich Democracies Repel Asylum Seekers, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. So welcome, David. Good to have you. And to my right is Kathy Friedman, associate professor in the Jackson School and adjunct in sociology and gender, women, and sexuality studies. And Kathy has published extensively in the area of comparative forced migration and immigration. To my left, Natalie Williams, associate professor in the Jackson School and sociology. And Natalie has also published extensively about migration patterns, particularly in the context of armed conflict, natural disasters, and climate change. And so we're really grateful to all of you for being here. So the program is, we're going to turn it over to Rowan and then to David for any quick additions you'd like to make. And then we will, I think my order says Kathy and then Natalie. It's okay, for about 10 minutes each. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. So welcome, everyone.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to our critics for being here. Thanks, David, for coming to my home institution. And thank you all for being here today. It's such an absolute pleasure to be able to share this work with you all. We thought we'd get started with just a little bit of background information about how this project came to be. We started working on refugee issues together around 2011. And it was a topic that both of us cared a lot about. And it wasn't until 2015 that the rest of the world, which actually really means the states in the global north, specifically thinking about the European response to displacement, started to pay attention to refugee issues. And so we had initially started with a project of thinking about how to bring sociology of international migration into conversation with studying forced displacement. And that led to our annual review piece, and ultimately that work has grown and expanded. And in fact, we even critique ourselves and move beyond that in the refugee system. Yeah, so just to situate the project here for you a bit.
Yeah, thanks. I'll go ahead and stand here if you don't mind. It's truly a pleasure to be with you and to be with Rowan sailing in her home waters up here, as it were. When I started working with Rowan in 2011, she had already been working for some years on the situation of Iraqi refugees living in Jordan. And I remember going to the early sessions at the ASA, and there was really no one else interested in American sociology and refugee issues, apparently. It was shocking. There would be one round table, there would be a session with nobody else in the room and just Rowan, maybe one other person working on these issues. So she was a prophet in the desert. A real pioneer in this field, and it wasn't until refugees started arriving in large numbers from outside Europe, that North American and European sociologists started paying attention to something that she had been working on for a long time. So, it's been a pleasure to work on these issues, and I just want to, start out showing you what it is that we were reacting against when we came up with this book that draws heavily from her own dissertation research, as well as some other work that I have been doing around international migration. And the fundamental problem that we were addressing is that so much information about refugee issues and displacement is siloed. It's coming out of really discrete bodies of knowledge that are primarily oriented towards policy work or humanitarian operational work, which makes a lot of sense. That's fine. We have no complaint with that. What we're observing, though, is that because so much of that knowledge is produced with that one purpose, it is then used by academics in ways that really hamper analysis. Because we are not providing humanitarian operational work. We are not directly creating refugee policies. So we need, in our view, to take some distance between what Joe would call categories of practice and categories of analysis in order to have a deeper analysis. So the specific silos that we're reacting against and trying to offer a better alternative are several. One of them is the tendency to have really discrete bodies of knowledge and different interdisciplinary studies. So one of those is conflict studies that looks at what are the origins of conflict, but really are not interested in people who are displaced by conflict once they have left a conflict zone, unless they continue to somehow be involved in that conflict. So if someone is a refugee who just leaves and kind of drops off the local map, that person's experience drops out of conflict studies. Then there is international migration studies, which especially in North American sociology has primarily come up around the study of labor migration and paid little systematic attention to the specificity of people fleeing violence and persecution. And then you have refugee studies, and the whole logic of refugee studies is to say that, oh, look, there's something special about refugees. And often the UNHCR will say refugees are not migrants because refugees have this exceptional preference to not fall under the same kinds of migration control as other kinds of migrants. We can understand why they do that, but the problem is that then that body of knowledge, refugee studies, pretends that refugees are not migrants and is unable to take advantage of and avail themselves of this massive body of literature around the experience of international migrants and explaining why people leave a particular place and go to another place. So what we try to do is to break down those kinds of silos. There are also other silos, even when it comes to the humanitarian agencies. There's a UN agency, the UNHCR, that deals with all refugees in the world, except Palestinians, who fall under the remit of UNRWA. And depending on the year, Palestinians are the first, second, or third largest refugee group in the world. So this is a very important omission. In the field of law, there are distinct bodies of humanitarian law, immigration law, refugee law, even though substantively the phenomena really should involve an understanding of all three of those bodies of law. Other kinds of silos we could talk about. Okay, so what is the problem with that? Well, there's a tendency in the literature to adopt just this highly legalistic definition of refugees. The standard definition coming out of the 1951 convention is that a refugee is someone who is outside their country of origin, who cannot return to the country of origin because they would face persecution on one of 5 particular grounds: their race, religion, national origin, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And we're not hostile to legal definitions of refugees. If you're doing refugee status determination, if you're in a court doing an asylum hearing, you have to have a legal definition. The problem comes that the legal definition is a political construction at a particular time with particular purposes. And if we use that as analysts, then we miss all of the other kinds of people who are in refugee-like situations, or maybe they're sociologically in exactly the same situation, but they're under-recognized because they don't fit the political purposes of those making the determination. So that's just one reason why we want to have that kind of difference. Another problem with the way that this body of work is siloed is that it hides the connections between different kinds of migrations. The fact that so many refugee movements follow channels that were first created by labor migrations. And then once those channels are established, they generate new kinds of migration that don't necessarily have to do with persecution or violence in an immediate sense. They become more like labor migrations or family reunifications. So the only way to see these kinds of long-term iterations is to tear down this barrier between the study of refugees and international migration more broadly. We also see that at a policy level, many different policies that are created today are not simply a reaction to the crisis of the day. They've been deeply formed by the experience of managing refugee movements, sometimes decades earlier. You see this, for example, with the way that the Lebanese government has addressed the situation of the many Syrian refugees in that country. is very much related to the way that the Lebanese government addressed the situation of Palestinian refugees beginning in 1948. And then we see also that there are these cycles of diffusion where policies in one country are extremely influential in other countries, and then sometimes reverberate back and are reformed in another country. And so we trace these policies, and sometimes they're policies that are more expansive, that have to do with refugee resettlement or asylum procedures. And more often than not, they are different techniques of restriction and keeping potential refugees and asylum seekers away from a country where they can ask for asylum. So there's this kind of iterative race to the bottom as countries like the UK and Australia and the US are taking note of what the other one is doing, coming up with a policy for their local circumstances, and then that will in turn affect policy in the original policy exemplar country some years later. So we show all of these things, and the general strategy of the book is to take the different stages of displacement and put them into one conversation. And this is quite different from the way that most of the sociology of all things refugee is done, which is to focus on just one stage. So you've got work on just refugee resettlement, or just on asylum, or just on conflict, but not looking at the connections between those things. Not looking at the way that, for example, integration into a resettlement scenario like the US or Canada or Australia often begins years in advance in another country, where those pre-integration policies such as English language instruction and all kinds of cultural training and so forth, that's all taking place in a different country long before someone arrives at JFK or LAX, just to give you one kind of example. So I won't belabor every single chapter here, but beginning with this chapter 5, for example, on exit, we take seriously what are the goals of actors, whether they're state actors or combatants, and purposefully pushing out refugees, strategies of genocide, other forms of ethnic cleansing, efforts to keep refugees from leaving, the whole panoply of strategies that these actors have, because we know that refugees don't just leave because there was a war. Sometimes that happens, but they're often very, very deliberate rationales that go into these refugee movements at the point of exit. And then we looked at hosting in the mini global souths. This is something that Ron in particular has been working on for years, as I said, in Jordan, but also doing some really interesting comparative cases with Saudi Arabia and Peru and other countries around the world. We look at the logics in powerful states like the US or France or the UK, the transnational connections, returns, different kind of diasporic homeland ties, and so forth. One of the major themes here is the feedback loops, which I referred to earlier, a couple of examples. And in this project, we pay special attention to a longitudinal case study that Rowan's been doing for more than a decade that she'll talk about now. But we also draw on examples that we take from around the world and from examples that are often decades or even centuries old to better understand this truly global system. So I'll turn it over to Rowan now to take us to the end.
Thank you, David. You can imagine if we're interested in taking a systems approach to push against the silos that have emerged when it comes to refugee knowledge production, this book is inherently very interdisciplinary. Specifically, we're really interested in bringing together these 3 different approaches to studying forced displacement and reception. And those include conflict studies, forced displacement, and international migration. Now, you may be wondering, if you're going to create a book that covers so much, what kind of scaffolding can you use to fit these pieces together? So beyond thinking about that table of contents that shows you the trajectory of, let's say, a composite refugee who would leave from navigating internal displacement in the country of origin to displacement in neighboring states to potentially seeking asylum or being resettled and then return, we've created this matrix, which we call the mobility immobility chessboard, which really serves as a scaffolding for the book in some ways. Before I dive into this, I want you to begin by conceptualizing the ways that we often think about refugees in response to other kinds of migrants. Think about the refugee-migrant binary that often frames the ways in which these conversations start. Now that's been critiqued in many different ways to show that people actually move along a spectrum. We take that spectrum and we blow it up into this matrix. So we consider degrees of movement and degrees of coercion. And along that, we create this matrix. I don't want you to conceptualize that these squares are, even though they're equidistant on the screen, we're not trying to say that they're equally apart. We just want to show you the variety that one can consider and that one can operationalize when putting these literatures together. So in terms of degree of movement, we consider domestic movement inside the state. We consider movement that is international. So here we're playing with the 1951 definition and we're thinking about the ways in which crossing a state border defines a refugee and that how that definition has been operationalized in other studies, whether it's sociology or more broadly. And then we also think about international return as the furthest along the degree of movement. Now, most of the world's people are going to be voluntary non-migrants. That's just a lot of words to say people who have not moved, right? Let that be the point that situates your thinking on this matrix. And if we want to think about the study of international migration, specifically sociology of international migration, that would include internal migrants, authorized migrants, or unauthorized migrants. So now, going back to what David had presented, if we're considering these legacies or the path-dependent aspects of migration, you can imagine how the study of international migration will now connect to other forms of movement, forced mobility or immobility. We systematically think about people who can't leave. And so we theorize about immobility throughout this text, which is essentially how we've grown beyond that annual review piece as well. So in this context, we think about people who can't move, but they face many degrees of coercion. Everything from not being able to exit, to being besieged, targeted and in hiding, and to being killed at home. And so from there, we bring conflict studies throughout the book. Moving on here, now you can imagine how we're bringing refugee studies in. So now we're thinking about people who are IDPs, internally displaced, people who live in an open camp. This might be what you are more likely to see in the media in terms of representations of refugees in the global south, to asylees and resettled refugees, voluntary or involuntary. But we really unpack that as well to think about coerced return, other types of return. And this is important because we move away from refoulement, which is essentially tied to the legal definition and legal framings to understand people's experiences. And within that context, also think about their global networks. Oh, great. Okay. It's not working. There we go. Finally, throughout the book, we also discuss the relationship to other forms of coercion and movement. And so we talk about prisoners. We also discuss indentured servants and transported slaves. So this would fit within the umbrella of forced migration or forced immobility, bringing that into conversation with the study of refugees and forced migrants more broadly. We also introduce in the book the new economics of displacement. Here, we move from the individual level to understanding the experiences of refugees, migrants, and people who are forced to be immobile, thinking about and over the next 10 years, okay, so this is supposed to move slowly, but it didn't. So when he goes, imagine this. He goes from being just a person who is at home living in Dara to being internally displaced. We talk about the challenges of internal displacement, to living in an open refugee camp in Zaatari refugee camp, finally being a resettled refugee, and very recently was given Canadian citizenship. Now, if we're only thinking about this on the individual level, that in and of itself is helpful. However, now we're going to pivot to think about the family. So, Wajih is now an authorized migrant. This means his access to rights and resources is distinct than what it was at every other stage in this process. And he can now sponsor or support his family. But when you think about how worthiness and constructions of refugees and forced migrants are created, we also need to recognize that he is related to people who are in an open refugee camp, right? So part of his family is in an open refugee camp. He has a brother who was applying to be resettled as a refugee. He has a family who is internally displaced and cannot leave. His father was besieged, living in ISIS territory for some time. He has a brother that's considering seeking asylum, but Wajih essentially tells him, you don't want to put yourself in a position where you might be living in a closed camp like a detention center. And finally, he also has family that's been killed at home. So this allows us to move far beyond that migrant refugee binary and instead imagine people's lived experiences and on how states and changing policies over time limit their opportunities or might create and facilitate new opportunities, like in the case of somebody who was able to access citizenship and then sponsor their family. And with that, we thank you. And with that, we thank you so much for your attention and look forward to what our critics have to say. Thank you.
So, thank you. Thank you for your book. So, thanks to the CSDE for inviting me. comment on the refugee system, and thank you to Rowan and David for writing such a needed and valuable book. Why so needed and valuable? Well, as I thought about putting this brief commentary together, I decided to focus first on the noteworthy contributions of the text to students, literally university students, and to professors of refugee studies. Then second, I'd like to mention the specific insights that I appreciate about the book. And together, I think the two sets of comments, which I'm going to read so that in the interest of time, should establish just how significant a breakthrough in the scholarly field this book makes. I consider it a foundational text. So I've been researching and teaching courses on forced migrations for over 20 years, and there's no other single book like this, period. I really wish there was for a long time. Refugees specifically, or forced migrants generally, typically merit a chapter or subsection of texts that aim to be comprehensive about international migration, such as Stephen Castle's et al.'s The Age of Migration. And I needed a text that put people fleeing for their lives and searching for protection in a world historical context that simultaneously historicized the field of refugee studies. I needed a text to reflect self-consciously and critically on what I have been calling myself. I've been calling it the prism of forced migration studies, but now I have a different term. It's the systems approach. And thank you for that. The refugee system, with an emphasis on system, has nearly done it all. I assigned this book this term to the 30 students in my forced migrations class, their third and fourth year students and a handful of grad students. And I supplement it with case studies on refugee emergencies from the wars in Vietnam, Bosnia, Somalia. I have some guest speakers on Afghanistan and Syria, and some refugee memoirs, the latter of which I return to at the end. So I thought you would find their feedback valuable and confirming. So on a recent exam, I gave them 2 bonus questions. First, I asked, and they only got points if they answered in a serious way. First, I asked, what do you like about the text, the refugee system? Second, I asked, presumptuously, since I'm confident there will be a second edition, I asked, what improvements or changes would you like to see in the next edition of the refugee system? A lot of their responses are the same, so I've summarized the most common and thrown in some quotations. And here they are. So what do you like about the refugee system? Students found lots of ways to say that, and I quote, the Ask for a Family chapter is the best because it helps readers begin to understand what people go through. Students loved all, quote, the real world examples. For one student, this started with, and I'm quoting him, the use of examples like El Salvador in the beginning of the book, which helps explain newer difficult concepts like the idea of the systems approach. The next comment actually is my personal favorite. I think you'll enjoy it. Quote, the book isn't afraid to critique some of the current standings in the field of refugee studies, which helps make the book extra intriguing and more thought-provoking. Okay. So what would students recommend for the second edition? Most students wanted more charts, diagrams, colorful maps. I understand publishing it. Colorful maps and personal stories. Other students wanted to know how the pandemic impacted the refugee system, or how refugees were doing 10, 20, 30 years after getting asylum. Some students wanted attention paid to Afghan refugees in Pakistan and Iran who are too often in war. One student wrote, and I'm quoting her, she wrote, I wish race was talked about more. As we know, one's race, ethnicity, and religion can play a significant role in someone becoming a refugee, but it doesn't stop there. Horrid treatment can follow a refugee as they seek help from humanitarian organizations in transit or permanent host countries. Okay, so what do I like about the refugee system? As a former grad student of Emanuel Wallerstein's, I found this the situating of the refugee system within the modern world system, and the use of world system theory, very compatible with how I look at the topic. The systems approach is a huge contribution to the study of refugees, with its emphasis on showing, now I'm quoting you, showing how movements are shaped by the links among places of origin, transit, and host societies within a global system. Taking very seriously the motto of refugee advocates, I am here because you were there. The systems approach that you constructed lets you examine the operation of cumulative interactive economic and political processes, as well as feedback mechanisms that link people across time and place. But happily, you transcended the limitations of the world systems theory, near exclusive focus on macro structures and macroeconomic processes most of the time as well. The refugee system provides a path to understanding how microstructures, mesostructures, and macrostructures, mesostructures, and microstructures work together in the lived experiences of refugees. In that vein, you explain so well refugee, the experience of becoming and being a refugee in the context of refugeedom, the relationship between refugees, state, and society. Both myself and my students consider chapter 4, Should I Stay or Go, the signature chapter and contribution of the book. The chapter describes patterns in how people make migration decisions in the face of violence. Actually, I will move ahead. The fluidity embedded in your chessboard design overcomes many of the difficulties with ahistorical matrices and typologies of migrants, problems such as the creation of mutually exclusive categories, lack of relationships between people, and a static picture that doesn't evolve over time. Your chessboard contains both movement and immobility. That's important. It's not possible to understand the diversity in refugee communities without understanding the feelings that people who couldn't flee the violence until after the war, or those who lived under siege for years before migrating, have towards those who escaped at the start of or even before the violence started. That's true for Bosnian refugees who I've interviewed. It's becoming an important feature among Ukrainian refugees, and it's the topic of this week's reporting on Sudanese refugees. At the same time, can you hear me? Okay. At the same time, it's crucial, as you suggest, to recognize that the freedom to move back and forth across borders can sometimes constitute one of the solutions to persecution and violence, rather than simply being a problem. So, with that said, I hesitate to critique anything about the chessboard because I really love it and I find it enormously useful. However, I'm reminded of another phrase, this time by the Swiss novelist Max Frisch. We called for labor, but human beings came. I think so many years of doing oral history, interviewing with refugees, has moved me closer to the humanities than I ever imagined. Human beings, especially those facing violence, are not necessarily good accountants. Some are adventurous, some are risk takers, some are risk averse, some are rebellious, they're collaborative, they're generous, they're selfish, they're opportunist. They're easily pressured by other people, they're fearful, they're traumatized, they're lonely. Some are just plain lucky and some are just plain unlucky, regardless of the calculations they've made. Moreover, what looks like a joint family or household decision may really be obscuring intra-household inequalities, power struggles, and conflicts of interest along the lines of gender, generation, seniority, and age. I think you've tried to cover yourselves on this last point very well, however. If I had any recommendations for your second edition, it would be to not change a single thing except to move beyond the household unit to include more individual refugee voices, more refugee memoirs, to include especially narratives that that include their extra household networks, like friends, neighbors, traveling companions. Because violence creates relationships just as it destroys them.
We're running a little behind. That's okay. So it's 1:10.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I will keep my comments on the book short because Kathy's already very nicely said it and we already heard your lovely presentation, and I will post some questions for you guys. So the first thing, this book is extremely well written. It's thoughtful, it's interesting, it's compelling, it's informative. And when I approached it, I was like, well, who did they write it for? And the thing is, what they did that was so exceptional is that they behind the scenes, you can tell they took these complex, multifaceted, multidimensional issues, and they so clearly thought through them such that when they present them, it's very, very clear. So we don't find everybody in academia doing that. And so I wanted to compliment you on that. And what comes out of it is that who this is useful for is that they are complex, very thoughtful, compelling issues that they discuss here. So it is very useful for academics like myself to use as tools for our own work, and I appreciate that. It's also definitely appropriate for a college class textbook because of the clarity of presentation and how well this is thought through to present to the audience. In addition, I think this is appropriate for lay audience. As I was reading this, I could imagine my parents who are retired and not social scientists in any way saying, hey, I read this in book, like talk about it. So I think you come up with a book that is smart enough and analytical enough and informative enough for people like us all the way through the college classroom for undergraduates and the lay population. And that is rarely done. And I hope your publisher realizes that as well. The other thing that I found particularly compelling about this, it's so wide ranging in what they cover, not just the topics, but the examples in particular. So many, maybe most paragraphs, they start it with, this is also great writing that I would love my students to do. They have the first sentence is a point, and then the rest of the paragraph is, here's an example, here's an example, here's an example. Next paragraph, they make a point and then use all these examples. But what's so exceptional about this is they range throughout history, like really, they come up with examples from several hundred years ago in ways that we don't often, that are largely forgotten in refugee and migration and conflict studies. So wars that we don't talk about anymore that really help us understand how war and migration has changed over the hundreds of years, instead of just focusing on now and thinking that this is some anomaly in history, which it is not. So I commend you on your use of history throughout. And also they range throughout the globe. They have examples all over the world. Those conflict and forced migration studies, we use the classic examples. And right now those are Ukraine, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, right? That's what people talk about because that's what we know happens from the international news. However, there's so many more conflicts in the world that we don't often talk about, but they do. They pull examples, really well-placed examples from all of these conflicts, and they give us an idea, the whole book together, what's really going on in the world that is far beyond what we can get from the New York Times. So thank you for that. I also really appreciate the systems approach, which is good that I appreciate that. So this is what you're trying to do, and it worked. But one thing about that is that, so the conflict and forced migration studies, we often analyze one particular piece of it, myself included, especially if you're doing a journal article, but the rest of it we leave as black boxes, and we're all fine with leaving those as black boxes. In this book, it's kind of nice that the cover is black because they open up all the black boxes and they open up all the can of worms. And so I really appreciate that, something that most people don't do. So my questions are, they're kind of can of worms questions for you guys. So you might think she's opening it up, and I would say, well, you open it up. I'm continuing. You asked for it. So I fear they're a little bit long, but I will try to end with a clear question so you know what I'm asking. So in chapter 2, they discuss who is a refugee, and this is a classic conundrum of defining who is not a refugee, and they do a really nice job. Most people approach this in the literature of the 1951 Refugee Convention, owing to a well-founded fear of, I will not continue. They didn't do that, but instead they started with that. There's that definition, there's a constructivist approach, there's a realist, there's a sociological, there's self-identification, all these different approaches. And not only that, but they told us what is the use or how do people use these differently. But all of these, including your chessboard, is all these are based on the idea of coercion and really violence. So the coercion is that if you stay as your voluntary non-migrant, like you will die, right? There's coercion of death in there. And that's why we seek to define these things and study them and understand them better, because someone's going to die. And so, but it's often restricted to death by violence, right? But you notably use the word coercion. So I want to bring in here the coercive factor of structural violence. That is not a bomb. That is not another person with a gun. That is the conditions under which we live that make living not possible, under which someone would, and I bring this back to, you would die. So that is poverty, that is economic structures and inequality and discrimination in certain countries, under which if people stayed, they would die. Right now, we classify those as economic migrants, but there's something different than if David offers me a job in San Diego and I move because I have more money or I want the sun, right? That's an economic migrant. But what about the person who would die because of structural violence? They're not on this. So I want to ask you guys and open this up to how would your typology, would it make sense to include in your typology of refugeehood and coercion, those people who are coerced and face the risk of death, but through structural violence and not interpersonal or like gun violence? Would that make sense? How would it work, both from an ethical perspective or from a sociological and analytical perspective in our legal protection? That's one. I have another question. Would you like to answer that? And then if you're running time, or should I do the other? Okay, other can of worms. It's another can of worms. So this stems from my perennial and all of our perennial interest in understanding why people flee, associated when they flee, where they go, and so on. Which is clearly, you address this in this book, and it's all over in multiple chapters, right? But one thing that I always wonder about, and I can never get my head around, you guys have a lot about this anecdotally, but I wanted to kind of package it up and set it in front of your face, is the issue of information. So we all have information about the refugee system, and because we study it, and you guys write a book for us, and we go to talks and we study laws and whatnot, right? So we know all the different options and what those mean and what are the outcomes if you ask for one of those options. But the normal lay population, if I go out there and ask that woman if she knows the difference between a refugee and asylum seeker, she would probably run away, right? Most people don't know these things. And so when we, knowing all these things, analyze why someone flees and why a bunch of people do things, right? We're coming at it with full information. And I want to ask, what kind of information do these actors on the ground actually have? And how might that change over different points in time? And how could we analyze their situation differently if we think about not having full information? So you consider a Syrian whose town has recently been engulfed by war, and we would have the understanding that they have multiple options. They could go be an IDP, they could go north to Turkey, they could go to Jordan, they could go to Lebanon, they could get on a plane to Germany and go to the immigration desk and say, can I please request asylum? That's the statement you're supposed to say. But we know they have those options. What did they know at that particular point or any point in time in their journey? For an Afghan person, their options might be to go into hiding, which you have there, or to get a smuggler to take them undocumented to Europe, or to get on a plane to the US and request asylum, or go to Pakistan and request to refugee status, right? All these different things. What do they know? So where I work in Nepal, they have labor brokers that go around to people's doors and like literally knock on their door. And when they open it, they say, hey, you want a job in Qatar? Here's what it's like. And they give you the full information. Here's how much it costs. Here's the plane. Here's your job. And they have systems of one opportunity, full information. But what I'm asking about is given all of your work and talking to all these people and thinking about this, what kind of information do people really have? Be it accurate or not accurate? How does that change over their journeys? And how might that change how we think about all of the system if we think about it from perhaps the lack of full information. And now I am done.
Thank you both.
Juan and David, we are running a little behind, but obviously want to give you a chance to respond to whichever ones you choose, but if we could leave a few minutes for Q&A, that would be great too.
Do you want the information question?
Yeah.
Information, okay, then you want to do structural violence?
Sure.
And then, okay, what an interesting question. Thank you both so much. I couldn't help but imagine if we wanted to tackle this question about information, I would think, my first thought is to say it's not always accurate. Well, you're like, yes, it's not always accurate information, right? So I just would start off by saying that sometimes people have inaccurate information, and that's really important. I would also push against the premise that we know that these are the options that exist for them, because so much of that is retroactive. And the example that we had talked about in the book that came to mind is essentially thinking about people returning, in the context of World War II and the Holocaust, right? In terms of what they imagined they would be returning to. And so in that way, that's how we're also pushing against durable solutions. Like this assumption that if you return, your home will be there. Sounds like such a basic assumption, and yet even that is not something that we can take for granted. But if you're asking more about like what have I learned specifically from talking to people on the ground about what they know, which I think is a slightly different, I can narrow the scope in some ways with that question. I couldn't help but remember how, whenever I would end interviews, I always ask, is there anything you want to ask me? And oftentimes that was an information gathering opportunity, right? So people would say, so it sounds, if we get resettled to the United States or Canada, we heard that kids stop loving their parents after 18 and they just move out. Is that true? Right? So that wouldn't necessarily fall within the scope of what people might consider to be refugee studies or the studies of migration. And yet this is what refugees are asking in terms of how they might make decisions, right? I think the proliferation of WhatsApp and how people share information on WhatsApp. I'm reminded about an interview with somebody who was crossing in 2015, traveling through Croatia, and they interviewed him on NPR, and he said, Croatia, never heard of that place, but here I am, So like how information is, I just love the idea of unpacking what information actually is, as the idea that you're learning about what Croatia is on routes, I suppose another thing in terms of what people know is to think about rumors and the ways in which those play out as well. And the ways in which information can be weaponized. I've remembered a story or something I learned through conducting interviews with Sudanese refugees. So I'll try to say this in the shortest way possible, but it's so interesting that I think it's worth sharing, which is, so Canada decides we need to resettle a large number of refugees in 2015, right? And in order to do that, they have to do it in a short period of time for their own political humanitarian reasons. They end up sending out these mass text messages to Syrians. I was doing interviews at the time and people were asking me, Canada texted me, do you think I should go? I was like, what do you mean Canada texted you? I remember was this conference at UCLA, when this was around the time, a couple of years after this happened, and I met somebody from the Canadian government that was like, yeah, we just texted a bunch of people. Okay, right? Very interesting. And then that was weaponized against a different group. So then Sudanese refugees received a bunch of text messages and were told, congratulations, you've been selected for potentially being resettled to Canada. Those people were then essentially subjected to forced deportation. And many people had to actually flee away from where they had gathered in this like plane hangar space. And I know that this is not a rumor because I was interviewing Sudanese refugees at the time. Specifically, I'm reminded of this one man who is now taking care of an infant because his wife was deported. So you see how information and rumors can also be mobilized against refugees. I saw you check your phone, so I handed it out to you.
I have failed in my job.
No, you're doing a great job.
You have 7 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, so let me just take up this point about what Alex Betts calls survival migration in terms of what's the role of economic deprivation and maybe extreme economic deprivation and a scheme like this. And one of the reasons why we have this particular scheme is that we are sociological realists, meaning we do think that there is something different about the experience of people who move, at least in large part, because of the threat of violence, including the violence that underlies persecution, which interacts then with all kinds of other economic factors. So it's not that refugees are apart from other kinds of migrants in every way, but we do think there's something particular about violence, drawing on the Zollberg framework, which is why that's central here. Now, ideally, there would be a third axis, and I don't know how we would represent it without a giant Rubik's Cube that we would roll out that would show that, because it's easy to imagine areas in this chessboard where economic deprivation shows up. Presumably, someone is willing to take the risk of being an unauthorized immigrant if they're facing much more economic deprivation than authorized immigrants, for example. Grosso modo. But you certainly don't see that systematically here. So ideally, you really would need that as a third dimension. And I think we do hope down the road to write another edition, and we have to work through that. In the text, we talk about the interaction between economic punishment as a form of persecution, and you kind of get this with the Refugee example. But I think it's a fair criticism that that's not, fully theorized throughout the text, and we need to work on that. And then I'll end just with a quick point about thinking about the way that the household interacts with other levels of analysis. And I think if we were to rewrite that, we would rely on some really important new work that's coming out showing how, for example, migrants in transit through Mexico have to rely on strangers that they meet. And yet those strangers are also some of the biggest threats to their well-being. So both of those things are happening. So I'm thinking specifically of a new book that just came out this year from Alejandra Diaz de Leon at the Colegio de Mexico. So we rely on that kind of thing. Or Hannah Poole has a spectacular new ethnography looking at Afghans coming through Iran, through many different European countries, trying to reach Germany. And that's a great place to see the interaction between the household level and smuggling networks, which are actually quite closely intertwined. So I think you're absolutely right that that's a place where we could actually meet several of these suggestions that your students had, and also try to drive the theorization forward. So thanks for that.
All right, I think we have time for one or two questions. I don't know if there's anybody on Zoom or anybody in the room. Okay, anybody in the room?
I'm gonna go outside and enjoy this beautiful.
All right. And is there anything else you would like to add?
Yeah, I guess, I think there's a question.
Oh, yes, sorry.
So I'll ask a question since somebody else had. The point that one of the reviewers mentioned about the intra-household bargaining. Do you have any comment about that and how that, there's a whole literature about that, not specifically on refugees and migrants, as far as I know, but it seems like that might be integrated into this as well. But how you decide whether to stay or go, or where to go.
Thank you for the question and also for the critique and topic to dive into. I think that given that we were focusing on one family, I think we navigated kind of the ways in which they took into consideration age and gender, and specifically how it was tied to persecution. But to move beyond that and to instead pivot from that to think about power dynamics within the family themselves and how those might shape interactions, I think that is a concrete difference and something that is worth doing in the future that I hope maybe we can do in a second edition as well. I just think it's a good idea. I don't have something to push against it in any way. I think it would be, I enjoy thinking about what it would be like to include several families, several pedigrees. Imagine what that kind of field work would look like, right? And specifically thinking here about the difference between conducting interviews and doing ethnography. I could imagine that an ethnography that spends time with these families in different spaces could reveal a lot of really interesting and important insights around this topic. And so, I really appreciate the direction that you've steered us in that way. Thank you.
And I would say just on that one point, but one of the reasons why we emphasize the household model is that the UNHCR, well, the UN 1951 definition is highly individualistic. So we're trying to push back against that to show this is actually part of a household level system, but it's not only a household level system. But that's really why we think the household level is so important. And then the second piece is to say, look, if we bring in insights from the sociology and economics of international labor migration, we can learn a lot about how people manage all kinds of risks. That literature coming out of economics is about managing economic risks, such as a drought or lack of access to credit markets and things like that. So we can take that framework and we can then add in all of the physical risks that are at the cause of the movement for refugees, as well as the kinds of risks that they encounter on the way, which are sometimes even more serious, i.e. Death at sea, trying to cross the Mediterranean, for example. So it's a framework for thinking about managing different kinds of risks collectively, but certainly there's a better way to also link that to these other meso-level structures as well.
Can I just piggyback on that? I think one thing that I learned working on, thinking through this lens that I think is worth emphasizing is oftentimes we think not only about the individual, but the individual faces potential death and wants to flee. But there's a difference that comes out when focusing on this family about direct persecution tied to a member of the family and navigating that, weighing it against this kind of anonymous, let's say, barrel bombs where anybody can get hit at any time. And so you can imagine, so in the case of the Osfor family, it turns out that the sons that had protested were being targeted by the state because they had been filmed protesting. And when they were in a position where the family was internally displaced and there was fear that they would be found out, the entire family made a decision to put themselves in a place where they could randomly lose their lives because of barrel bombs, as opposed to having these individual members of the family be directly targeted, right? So all of this complicates the equation of how people make decisions and understand threats. And beyond that, it allows you to imagine how people weigh different threats. And all of that, to tie it back to your questions about information, is you have people who are working with limited information and a lot of unknowns. And so one of the, I think, endlessly interesting ways to continue to try to understand people's lived experiences is they have to make decisions when they don't know what all the outcomes are. Right.
I think a miracle has happened and it was perfect timing. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And thank you so much to all the speakers. It's great.
Thank you.